It began with thunder. Not the kind that rolls through skies, but the kind that erupts inside a marble chamber built to contain decorum. Applause, raw, thunderous, echoing, burst from the back benches of the Senate gallery as Elizabeth Warren stepped down from the podium, her face glowing with emotion, eyes damp with staged sincerity. She had just finished a fiery speech declaring student debt forgiveness a moral imperative, comparing it to freeing a generation from financial chains. The cameras zoomed in. A tear rolled gently down her cheek, just in time. The applause grew louder, awkwardly sustained, like everyone was clapping for the performance, not the principal. Staffers exchanged glances. Even her critics hesitated. It felt like a moment. It wasn't. Not yet. Across the room, seated in the second row, Senator John Kennedy didn't clap. He didn't move. He simply placed his fingertips atop a pale folder that had been resting silently in his lap, sealed with a thin string and no label. His gaze never left Warren as she returned to her seat with a practiced smile, nodding at colleagues like a stage actress returning for curtain call. But Kennedy's eyes weren't applauding. They were waiting. And deep in his coat pocket, a handwritten note, dated 13 years ago, pressed against his chest like a memory refusing to fade. The chair thanked Senator Warren. Cameras began to swivel back to neutral. A few aides in the gallery lowered their phones, assuming the show was over. But the real show hadn't even started. The air in the room shifted when Kennedy stood. No dramatic music, no stomping steps, just the sound of an old chair creaking back and a man with more patience than pride rising at exactly the right time. "Madam Chair," he began, with the calmness of someone about to rearrange the temperature of the room. "I won't take long. Just a question." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because suddenly everyone who had been clapping 30 seconds ago was no longer sure what they'd been clapping for. Kennedy didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to the silence between them. "Senator Warren speaks with great emotion," he said, "but there's a line between feeling something and using it, between shifting your heart and shifting your story." He paused, not for effect, but because it mattered. And then, with the quiet elegance of a man folding a flag, he opened the folder. From it, he pulled one single sheet, slightly yellowed with age, and held it up without drama. "This," he said, "is a transcript." 2008, a speech at a university town hall. Senator Warren, then a professor, called student loan forgiveness fiscally reckless and morally unfair to those who paid their debts. Gasps are rare in Senate chambers, but someone did inhale sharply. Kennedy looked directly at Warren. "I have no interest in arguing. I have no need to accuse. But I do have one question." He stepped slightly forward, letting his voice drop. Not louder, but deeper. "When your view changed, did your principles change? Or just your polling?" Time stopped. It didn't slow down. It froze. The weight of the question landed not like a punch, but like a mirror, and for a moment no one looked into it. Warren blinked. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The paper Kennedy held trembled just a bit, not from his hand, but from the air itself. Thick, electric, expectant. And right now, if you're still watching, ask yourself, what do you think matters more, a good speech or a consistent soul? If you feel that question cuts deeper than applause ever could, hit that like button and type 9 in the comments. Because the moment you're witnessing, it's not politics, it's something much older. It's the test every person faces the second their past comes knocking while their future is watching. Kennedy folded the paper, placed it on the podium, and didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The silence was already doing the heavy lifting. Warren didn't answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But the question wasn't going away. It had already begun to echo. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. The silence didn't end when Kennedy returned to his seat. It deepened. It swelled like an invisible tide swallowing the edges of the chamber. Elizabeth Warren didn't reach for the microphone. She didn't adjust her blazer or glance toward the chair. Instead, she sat perfectly still, her hand resting atop her stack of notes, knuckles pale, breath shallow. A few aides shifted uncomfortably in the background, eyes darting to each other as if silently deciding whether to break protocol or let her sit in it. And sit she did. Because how do you respond to a question that doesn't accuse you, but somehow accuses everything you've built? The cameras didn't cut away, didn't cut. The C-SPAN feed lingered on her face, the flicker of emotion dancing beneath the surface. She was calculating. Everyone could see it. Not because she was disingenuous, but because she understood the stakes. If she pushed back too quickly, she'd seem defensive. If she waited too long, it would look like evasion. And maybe worst of all, if she said too much, she'd be handing the public an answer that didn't match the question. The chair cleared her throat, ready to move on to the next item. But she hesitated, sensing that the moment was bigger than procedure. Then, from the gallery above, a phone went off. Not a ringtone, just the unmistakable vibration sound followed by a sharp whisper. He actually said it. The person next to them whispered back, "It's already on Twitter." The chain reaction had begun. Downstairs, in the press bullpen, a young intern hit publish on a 29-second clip titled, "Kennedy's Question Shocks the Room." Within minutes, it was being shared faster than even the morning's major legislation summary. The video had no soundtrack, no overlays, no edits, just the raw stillness of the chamber, Kennedy's soft voice, and Warren's frozen face. Meanwhile, on the floor, a small but growing ripple was forming. Senator Tillis leaned forward slightly in his seat, watching Warren closely. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't smirking. He was studying. Across the aisle, Senator Booker whispered something to his aide, who immediately pulled out a tablet and began searching for archived footage from 2008. Within seconds, he found it. A clip of Warren, pre-political fame, in a lecture hall packed with graduate students, confidently proclaiming, "There's a danger in promising people freedom from responsibility. Debt builds character. Accountability builds trust." And there it was, the proof, not of hypocrisy, but of evolution without explanation. Back on the floor, Warren finally moved, not toward the mic, but toward the glass of water beside her. She lifted it with grace, sipped, and then placed it back down. Still no words, still no answer. But that simple pause, that delay, it was louder than a rebuttal. By the time the next speaker took the podium, the energy in the room had fractured. Nobody was really listening to the prepared remarks about transportation funding. Not because they were boring, but because the air hadn't cleared. The question still hung there, suspended above the Senate like fog that refused to lift. And outside the chamber, that fog was spreading. News outlets scrambled to reorient their coverage. CNN bumped its segment on international trade to make room for a developing headline, "Senator Kennedy's Question Leaves Warren Stunned." On social media, political influencers from both sides of the aisle clipped the quote and began debating it live. TikTok creators duetted the moment with captions like, "When you change your values for votes," while others posed counter-arguments, "Is it wrong to grow?" But even those defending Warren struggled to look past the one thing that couldn't be spun, her silence. In classrooms, professors of communication began revising next week's lectures. A media literacy instructor in Ohio added the clip to a slide titled, "The Power of a Precise Question." A student in that class tweeted, "This should be in textbooks. Kennedy didn't destroy her. He made us think. That tweet hit 100,000 likes in 4 hours. And while the world was digesting the moment in pixels and clips, Kennedy himself was quietly closing the folder. He didn't glance around for approval. He didn't smirk or whisper to colleagues. He simply pulled out a small notepad, scribbled one line, no one knows what it said, and tucked it back into his jacket. Then he leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, as if the entire weight of the exchange didn't belong to him anymore. In that moment, something rare had occurred. A conversation had shifted. Not by force, not by volume, but by honesty, because Kennedy hadn't asked the question to win. He'd asked it to reveal. And now the whole country was sitting in the same kind of silence Warren had faced seconds earlier, wrestling not with outrage, but with truth. And the question kept ringing louder the longer it remained unanswered. When your view changed, did your principles change, or just your polling? Outside the chamber, the world was accelerating, but inside, time was still stuck in that question. The next senator's speech barely registered. Every word fell flat, like background noise to a moment that no one had moved past. Elizabeth Warren remained composed in posture, but hollow in expression. Her signature intensity, once the driving force of 100 interviews and rallies, had been replaced by something far more human: hesitation. The kind that happens when a person isn't just challenged, but caught between who they were and who they've tried to become. Somewhere on the Senate floor, a staffer tapped out a message. She's not responding, not even looking up. That message, forwarded 3 times, ended up in the hands of a journalist from the Hill, who tweeted a single word: unspoken. It was vague, even poetic, but everyone knew what it referred to. The post exploded. By now, the clip of Kennedy's question had crossed into the entertainment world. A late-night host interrupted his monologue to replay the line verbatim. No jokes, no punchline, just, "When your view changed, did your principles change, or just your polling?" He let the silence play out for 3 seconds before adding, "That might be the most honest moment I've ever seen in politics." The crowd didn't laugh. They clapped. But back inside the Senate, something else was brewing, something no one outside could see. Warren finally reached for her notes, not the ones for her speech, but an older folder tucked beneath the desk. Her fingers hovered over it, then retracted. The audience, at least those in the room, saw it, a subtle moment of reconsideration. She wasn't searching for a response. She was deciding whether to rewrite her own ending. At that exact moment, a sound broke the room's trance, the shuffling of papers. Kennedy was gathering his belongings, not hurried, not impatient, methodical, the kind of exit that feels complete, as if he knew his part in the story was done. He didn't glance back at Warren. He didn't nod at the chair. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out of the frame. The silence that followed was heavier than any outrage, because his exit wasn't dramatic. It was deliberate. It told everyone watching that he had nothing more to say because the truth doesn't need a second act. That's what made it cinematic. Not the confrontation, but the closure. Down the hall, reporters swarmed. Microphones waited. But Kennedy didn't stop. He gave no press statement, no tweets, no off-the-record comments. And in doing so, he gave the moment a kind of sacred weight. No spin, no victory lap. Just silence, echoing louder than any headline. Meanwhile, back on the Senate floor, Warren leaned forward, finally touching the microphone. But before she could speak, the chair recognized another senator. The moment had passed. Her window to respond on the record had closed, without force, without intention, just naturally. And sometimes, the worst punishment isn't being silenced. It's not knowing how to fill the silence when it's your turn. Outside, the reactions were no longer about her speech. They were about her pause. A political analyst on YouTube started a live stream titled, "The Pause Heard Around the Country." Within minutes, viewers flooded the chat. She froze. He exposed the contradiction. She owed us more than that, and over again, just one number: 9. Because by now, Kennedy's question had become more than a quote. It had become a prompt, a challenge, a mirror held up not just to Warren, but to anyone who's ever pivoted their truth without telling the people who trusted them why. And then came the twist no one expected. A college newspaper from Warren's alma mater unearthed an unpublished interview from 2009. In it, Warren stated clearly, "I don't believe in broad loan forgiveness. It sends the wrong message to young people. We earn our way through." The quote didn't match the speech she had just given in the Senate chamber, and just like that, a ripple became a wave. People didn't care about the policy anymore. They cared about the pattern, not what changed, but what never got explained. That night, hashtags trended: #, roots or polling, #, answer the question, #, Kennedy was right. Even Warren's most loyal supporters began to fracture, not in anger, but in confusion, because a cause without consistency becomes a campaign, not a conviction. And the public had been sold conviction. Back in his office, Kennedy reportedly told his aide, "I didn't want to embarrass her. I just wanted the country to remember that questions matter." And whether he intended it or not, that's exactly what happened. Because in an era addicted to outrage, it wasn't the fire that burned the brightest. It was the stillness after one clear, honest sentence. And that stillness was now spreading. By the next morning, the clip wasn't just viral, it was embedded. It played on loop behind cable news panels, stitched into TikTok reactions, transcribed into opinion pieces, and even opened a Sunday sermon in Georgia titled, "When a Question Reveals the Soul." But what truly stunned everyone wasn't just how fast the story spread, it was how quickly it outgrew politics. This wasn't a left versus right firestorm. It was something deeper, something colder, something far harder to shake. The public wasn't asking whether Warren was right. They were asking why she never answered. In classrooms from Boston to Berkeley, professors were pausing lectures to play the now iconic exchange. Students weren't mocking it. They were dissecting it. Media majors called it a masterclass in narrative reversal. Debate coaches showed it to their teams as an example of how precision outweighs passion. One student said, "He didn't destroy her. He exposed the part she couldn't defend." And perhaps even more startling, Warren still hadn't spoken. Not one clarification. Not one sentence to fill the silence she left behind. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, her team was unraveling. An internal memo leaked to Politico revealed urgent directives. Do not engage on Kennedy question unless framed positively. But there was no way to frame it positively, not without reopening the wound. Another staffer, anonymous but clearly close to the situation, told a reporter, "It wasn't the question that hurt. It was how prepared he was. It felt premeditated, surgical." At a press briefing the following afternoon, a reporter finally asked her point-blank, "Senator Warren, do you believe your change in stance on student loan forgiveness was based on new understanding or new polling?" Warren paused, just a blink too long. Then she smiled tightly and replied, "I've always fought for fairness, and I'll keep fighting." But that wasn't an answer. That was a soundbite, and the internet knew the difference. By 6 p.m., "She didn't answer" was trending nationwide. And then came the second twist. A short clip, barely 18 seconds long, posted by a college student on Instagram, began gaining millions of views. In it, Kennedy's question was layered over black and white footage of Warren's 2008 speech, side by side with her recent one. The caption read, "Same voice, different truths." The video didn't accuse, it didn't even edit for drama. It just let her words contradict each other. What made the moment explode wasn't outrage, it was recognition. People saw themselves in the gap between what Warren had once said and what she said now, between who she had been and who she was trying to become. And suddenly, the story wasn't just about her. It was about every public figure who had ever shifted without owning the shift. Back on Capitol Hill, Kennedy refused interviews. Reporters lingered near his office door, but he waved them off with the same soft-spoken manner that had made the original moment so powerful. He didn't need to explain himself. He had already asked the question. The rest wasn't his responsibility. Late that evening, Warren finally released a written statement. 3 paragraphs. Calm, measured, and utterly forgettable. It mentioned her evolving views, her deep empathy for students, and her commitment to equity. But not once did it address Kennedy's question. Not directly, not even sideways. And that, more than anything, became the headline. One commentator on MSNBC said it best. If you can't answer the question, maybe you shouldn't have made the speech. And then, something unexpected happened. Former students of Warren's began sharing old anecdotes, not malicious ones, quiet ones. Stories about how, in class, she used to emphasize personal responsibility over policy safety nets. One student posted, "She taught us to never let emotion override logic. I guess she forgot." The quote caught fire. Within 24 hours, a new conversation emerged, not about forgiveness, but about authenticity. Who gets to change their mind? And when they do, what do they owe the people who once believed in their original stance? Editorials popped up across the country. Is evolution without accountability still growth? The ethics of shifting truths. Do convictions expire? And in all of it, Kennedy remained silent. Not because he was hiding, but because he knew silence was now louder than any follow-up. The moment had become a mirror. And Warren? She had walked into the chamber to close a chapter. But instead, she had reopened a debate she thought she'd buried. And now, that debate didn't belong to her anymore. It belonged to the students who were paying attention, to the voters who were listening, and to the people who had been waiting for a leader to say, "I've changed, and here's why." But that sentence never came, and the question still hung there, undisturbed, unchallenged, unforgettable. When your view changed, did your principles change? Or just your polling? By the end of the week, Elizabeth Warren wasn't just dodging a question. She was disappearing beneath it. Her public appearances became shorter, her answers tighter, more rehearsed. Every time a journalist leaned in, hoping to catch even a whisper of vulnerability, she pivoted back to safe terrain. Funding numbers, tax codes, policy language thick enough to bury anything personal. But it was too late. The country wasn't listening for facts anymore. They were listening for the one thing she refused to offer: an honest reckoning. The question had become a kind of folklore, spreading without resistance, not in anger, but in reflection. Late-night shows tried to joke about it, but even the punchlines landed with restraint. The audience didn't laugh as much as they nodded, because deep down, they understood something bigger had happened. A shift, not in party lines or polls, but in public expectation. For once, a politician had been asked something real, and people weren't going to let the moment dissolve into noise. Then came the moment that broke the silence. Except it didn't come from Warren. It came from inside her own camp. A staffer, visibly shaken, leaked a video to an independent journalist. The clip wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no smoking gun. Just Warren in a strategy meeting, days before her Senate speech, reviewing drafts of her remarks. In the clip, she says quietly but clearly, "I know it's a shift. But people want empathy now, not lectures. We lead with emotion, then justify with numbers. No one in the room pushed back. No one asked why her new stance directly contradicted her prior convictions. And maybe that's what made the clip so devastating. Not the strategy, but the calculation behind the emotion. The journalist released it with a simple caption. So was it conviction or choreography? That line went viral, again. The fallout was instant and brutal. Not from political opponents, they had long moved on, but from those who had stood by her. Professors who had once taught her work, students who had once quoted her in final papers, journalists who had defended her integrity, all fell into the same quiet pattern of distance. Not condemnation, just disappointment. And across the aisle, Kennedy remained still. He hadn't spoken her name once since the day of the question. When asked in a passing hallway moment if he had seen the leaked clip, he simply said, "I don't watch what's whispered behind doors. I listen to what's left unsaid in public." But the damage wasn't done yet. In a televised interview meant to pivot her image, Warren sat down with a major network host. She was prepared. Notes on the table, lines rehearsed. The host smiled politely and eased into the conversation. Until the end. Final question. No warning. Senator, when your views on debt forgiveness shifted, did your principles shift as well? Or was it just the timing? The question hit like a ghost. A mirror held up once again. For 3 long seconds, Warren said nothing. Then she offered a half smile and replied, "I believe people evolve." But the host didn't let it end there. "Sure, but did you evolve in silence, or should voters have known when and why that change happened?" Warren froze again, only this time on national television. The clip went live before the segment even ended. One user posted it with the caption, "She blinked." And that blink was the answer. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't cancel culture, it was consequence, the natural gravity of public trust. That night, Kennedy appeared briefly at a university ethics panel, sitting alongside professors, judges, and civic leaders. When asked about the power of a well-timed question, he said, "You don't ask it to hurt. You ask it to clear the fog. Truth isn't always in the answer. It's in the pause before the reply." The room fell quiet. A student in the front row whispered, "That's why it hit so hard. He wasn't attacking her. He was giving her a chance." Another added, "And she didn't take it." And in that moment, it became clear. The real story wasn't that Warren had changed her mind. The real story was that she tried to skip the chapter where she explained it. That's what people couldn't forget. Because every person watching had, at some point, been forced to explain themselves to their parents, their kids, their boss, their partner. They had felt the pressure of being called out. And they knew how much it meant to simply say, "Yes, I changed. And here's why." Warren didn't say that. And so the silence grew louder. Not cruel, just clear. The weight of the moment wasn't in Kennedy's tone. It was in the question itself. How it echoed in classrooms, boardrooms, dinner tables. It was no longer about one senator. It had become a cultural checkpoint. What do we owe the truth when it no longer matches our story? And more importantly, do we admit it, or just wait for the applause to drown it out? Weeks passed, but the moment refused to die. Not because the media kept reviving it, but because ordinary people wouldn't let it fade. On podcast panels, in coffee shop debates, inside lecture halls and under dorm lights, the same question continued to hang in the air like a lantern. When your view changed, did your principles change, or just your polling? And by now, it wasn't just a question for Elizabeth Warren. It had become a question for everyone, about integrity, about timing, about the quiet price of reinvention. Campaigns tried to steer the narrative elsewhere. The debt crisis, new legislation, even foreign affairs. But the public didn't move on. Because the moment Kennedy asked that question, he tapped into something rawer than politics, the universal tension between who we were and who we pretend to be. One morning, a high school teacher in Minnesota played the clip for his senior ethics class. No commentary, just 30 seconds of stillness. Kennedy's voice, the room holding its breath, Warren blinking into silence. When the clip ended, he didn't speak. He simply wrote one sentence on the board. "What's the cost of not answering?" The room stayed quiet for a full minute. Then a student said, "Maybe the cost is trust." Another replied, "Maybe the cost is who we used to be." And from the back of the room, someone whispered, "Maybe it's nothing, if no one asks again." But someone had asked. Kennedy's question became more than a political moment. It became a test of character, replayed, rewritten, reimagined in every corner of culture. Professors dissected it as an example of moral rhetoric. Therapists referenced it in conversations about self-honesty. Even a tech CEO quoted it in a keynote speech about leadership transparency. A pivot without context is a gamble. A pivot with honesty is growth. And while Warren returned to her duties, giving passionate speeches and voting on key bills, something had changed. Not in her policies, but in how the room received her. People listened, but they didn't lean forward. The applause came, but it was thinner now, measured, like a crowd watching a play they didn't fully believe in. The story might have ended there, just another fallen moment in the 24-hour news cycle. But something deeper had begun. A recalibration. The kind that doesn't make headlines but changes minds. Across the country, everyday people, teachers, veterans, single parents, young voters, began using the question in their own lives, not out loud, but in reflection. Am I being real or just convenient? Am I holding this belief because it's true or because it's safer? The question, stripped of politics, had become something else entirely. A mirror. And Kennedy? He never spoke of it again. Not once. No victory lap. No follow-up interviews. He let the moment stand untouched, like a stone in the middle of a still lake. Reporters tried to bait him into expanding, but he'd always shake his head. "It's not about me," he'd say. "It's about what we do when someone asks us something we didn't prepare for." That silence, too, became its own answer. At a university town hall nearly 2 months later, a student asked Kennedy what advice he'd give to young people navigating public life. He paused, smiled softly, and replied, "Don't fear changing your mind. Just don't do it in the dark." The crowd murmured with appreciation. But the next line silenced them again. "If you change, bring us with you. Show your work. That's how we trust you." And maybe that was the real lesson all along. Not that Warren was wrong to evolve, but that she tried to skip the middle. She had updated her story without inviting the people who once believed in her to understand why. And in that gap, a single question had taken root. So the story doesn't end with scandal, or resignation, or some dramatic downfall. It ends with something quieter, and far more lasting. A shift, a standard. A moment where the world paused to remember that how you change matters as much as why you do. And in that silence, one man's voice, steady, honest, unshaking, still echoes. When your view changed? Did your principles change? Or just your polling? If that question made you think, made you pause, or made you reflect, hit like and share this story with someone who still believes that clarity matters more than applause. And tell us in the comments, what do you value more, evolution or explanation?